The Transitional 20s, Chapter 21. The words listed on the left side of your screen in red are some things that were going on in this country, not necessarily particularly here in Kentucky, but in the entire country during the 1920s, and I'll just very briefly go over them. The Red Scare was simply our fear of communism. Whereas we'd been thrilled to death when Russia had that revolution back in 1917, the idea of people overthrowing another king or a czar was great. But when the communists took over and they started espousing as workers of the world unite and overthrow capitalism, it scared us to death because our economy is based on capitalism. There was also a series of something like 20 some odd bombs sent in mails from New York City to various leaders throughout the country. And of course, we knew it was a communist work trying to destroy a Secretary of State, destroy the Attorney General, governors. Only one bomb actually went off before they caught him, but it was a communist plot. We knew that. And then the worst thing that could possibly happen, a police force went on strike. The prestigious Boston police force. Now, in their defense, they were being paid $1,000 a year. And out of that money, they had to buy their own uniforms, buy their own ammunition, support the family. They had formed a union, and that's where they made their mistake. Because at this point in time, in 1919, 1920, and 21, we were equating unions with communism. We knew it was a communist trying to stir up trouble. So, of course, they were all fired, and the new governor of Massachusetts hired all new policemen with the provision that they would not form a union. President Harding was the president, and although he himself was a pretty good old boy, he had this very bad habit of appointing people to his cabinet who were not qualified. And about into his second year of his term, it became evident that his staff they were corrupt. For instance, his Secretary of the Interior was taking land that was supposed to be public domain under the protection of the federal government and leasing it out to oil companies for drilling. When another one of the head departments, they were actually taking secrets that we gleaned from Germany after the war and selling them to places. So if the president hadn't died, he probably would have been impeached, and it would have been very bad. I mean, it was a scandal like you wouldn't believe. And of course, we'd had all the influenza right after the war, which we discussed last chapter, which we call the Spanish Lady. Tens of thousands of people died worldwide. We lost several thousand here in the state of Kentucky. Prohibition had been passed, but it wasn't popular with the people. The only people it was popular with was the people who pushed the bill through and your people who were against drink. Women had gotten the vote, and that was still causing a lot of debate. The dances they were doing, the foxtrot, the bunny hop, the Lindsay hop. I mean, these people were out there on the dance floor doing things that they shouldn't be doing, and they were shaking around and touching each other, and it was just absolutely scandalous. And this new breed of woman, the flapper, the clothes she was wearing was downright skimpy. Now, this was going on across the nation. Was it all going on here in Kentucky? No, Kentucky stayed pretty much rural. We wanted to kind of stay the way things had always been. Yes, we saw movies, and we saw about these changes and the new dress styles, so we were aware of what was going on, but they were not always accepted. And, of course, this new thing called automobiles. The older generation thought they were way too available, and according to statistics, in 1921, there was 127,000 of them in Kentucky. But that doesn't count the ones that are unlicensed on the farm, so there was more than that around. Newspapers had gotten so big, they'd started having things come in. They didn't have local people, reporters doing the report. They would have things come in on the wire service. And they were talking about scandals like murder trials and hangings and Titanic, ship sinking, things like that. You didn't have that much local news. But we're into an age of consumerism, and consumerism simply means the act of consuming. And for the first time in our history, our public is spending more money on things like going to the movies and buying automobiles and entertainment. They're spending more money on that than they are on paying for their housing or buying food. We are becoming a consumer nation. And of course, it's being encouraged because that's what drives our economy. We also have mass entertainment. Now, you young people cannot even imagine what it would be like to be in a world where there was no music or noise or anything going on. But before the advent of radio, it was just quiet. Any music you heard, you either played yourself or you went somewhere where there was a band playing. But with radio, not only can you sit in your home in, Henderson, Kentucky, or Paducah, or Lexington, and you can hear music being played in Chicago. Or you can hear the President of the United States make a speech and you hear the papers rattle because you hear him turning the pages. And you hear stories on soap operas, on, the little short stories, a little bit each day. You get news. I mean, it brings the world to your doorstep and you never have to leave. It's phenomenal. And the phonograph, I don't think there's anybody out there who doesn't know what a phonograph is, but a phonograph is a piece of equipment that plays something like you've got CDs now. We used to have something like a CD, only a lot bigger. It was black, it was vinyl, it had grooves in it, and you had to have a needle on this arm on this phonograph to play. But now we can have music in our homes. You didn't have to go to a bar or to a music hall or to a concert hall to hear music. You didn't have to go to a concert in the park. You could actually get any kind of music you wanted, jazz, popular music, opera, anything you wanted, you could come play in your home. And in the movies, oh yes, everyone was going to the movies. And the movies would introduce you to what people are dressing like, their hairstyles, new things that you might incorporate into your life. And of course, everyone wanted to look like that particular actress and played that part, that hairstyle or whatever. It also gave you a chance to escape reality for a little while. And fads, oh my gosh, the fads that were going on. The dance marathons where you dance for days, sitting on top of telephone poles, jumping rope. One of the fads, actually, believe it or not, was photography. Had new hobbies come along, and I still don't understand this one, but bridge became a very popular card game. Sports, now if you were upper class and rich and white, you could play golf or tennis. But for us poor sods, bowling was usually the game we played. Literature, you were introduced to mass production, pulp fiction, these little magazines called True Confession, True Detectives, a lot of it trash, what's going on in Hollywood type thing. But you also had people like Hemingway and Faulkner also writing during this period. We've got new music. George Gershwin is actually producing music during this time. And with all this going on, you've got 5 very important, what we call cultural conflicts going on. You've got gender, immigration, prohibition, teaching of evolution, and the sexual revolution. And I'm going to spend just a little bit of time on each one of them. Gender. Even though we've got the vote, it was still believed by many, especially here in Kentucky, that voting would cause the end of the world as it was known. Women would be exposed to the dangers and vulgarity of the voting polls because, they have whiskey there, they've got guns there, they've got men who haven't bathed or shaved, and you might bump up against them. And besides, I spelled a word wrong and I didn't catch it. If a woman were to use her brain to go into politics, she would lose her femininity and become, it's not supposed to be a legend, that's supposed to be a lesbian. And I apologize. Don't trust spell check. It was commonly believed that a woman had certain juices, if you will, in her body, and they was needed to help her body become a woman. And if she was using her brain, these feminine juices were going to go to the brain to help her function. And if she did that, she would not have the feminine juices going to the organs of her body that were needed, like the ovaries and the uterus, to produce children. So voting or becoming too educated, and we had certified doctors and psychologists saying the same thing, that she would lose her femininity and become a lesbian. Prohibition. Very unpopular among the common folks. But when the law was passed to make it against the law to manufacture, distribute, or sell alcohol, all of a sudden, because we Americans don't want to give up our spirits, where the river is a void, it's going to be filled, and it was filled by a new crime, became a national enterprise. And we had speakeasies all over the place. We had private stills in the backyard. We had bootlegging going on, bathtub gin. A lot of people died because their liquor wasn't properly processed. But it's going to be the inability to enforce this law that's going to contribute to the repeal of the law, which is going to make a lot of people happy. But for the few years it was in force, it was not a good scene. Then you had all those immigrants coming in. Now, we had been inundated back in the 1880s and 1890s, but then we got hit again after World War I because Europe had been so devastated. You got hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people coming in from Southern Europe, and they're Italians, they're Russians, they're Greeks, they're Lithuanians. They're the type of people that, well, we're not too happy with. I mean, they're Catholic, they're Jewish, they have anarchist ideas, they want to keep their own language and food and live in their own little ghettos, if you would. They just don't seem to fit into our American culture. And besides which, they're taking our jobs, and we're competing with them for housing. So the best thing to do is to keep them out or ostracize them. And of course, according to your text, it's just, the statistics were in the 1920s, our immigrant population was less than 2%. And that was usually in Louisville. But the teaching of evolution is what's going to cause a lot of trouble. It was a very high-profile case. It pitted Clarence Darrow against William Jennings Bryan, which were the two most famous lawyers of the time. The theory of evolution has been around for some time, but it was kind of put in the background. But when you get into the 1920s, and we start being inundated with information every time we turn around, giving us household hints and telling us about psychology and IQ tests, and they were one little star, and a big old group of stars, and we're very insignificant. Every time we turn around, there's something new coming along, and it gets kind of frustrating if you want to know the truth. So we're going to have this trial. John Scopes is a UK graduate and a biology teacher, and he and his buddies were sitting around one day, wanting to know what they could do to, kind of stir up a little problem, if you would. At least that's the way the story goes. They asked him what would happen, being a biology teacher, if he were to teach the theory of evolution at school, and he said, well, he'd probably be fired. He said, well, why don't you do it and see what happens? So, according to the story, he did. He was caught, and of course he was arrested, and there was going to be this trial. William Jennings Bryan had volunteered to help the prosecution. The ACLU, who I personally think was involved in this from the very beginning, was contacted, and they arranged for Clarence Darrow to defend Mr. Scopes. The trial was set for July 1925, and sure enough, it put this little sleepy Tennessee town of Dayton on the map with a bang. Now, I personally don't think there's anything too wrong with the people of a community deciding what their school is going to teach. It's their tax dollars. But in the issue of the Scopes case, which that's what it should have been about, should the local people be able to decide what's going to be taught in their schools. It wound up being a fight between the fundamentalist and the modernist. And the champions of both the causes were there. It was a very strange trial. The local farmers came in their mule-drawn wagons, very quiet, godly people wearing overalls, the men, and the women wearing gingham, and they're ready to defend their faith against these foreigners that had come to their town. They'd heard about this evolutionary theory, but they don't know what it was. And of course, we've got revivalists flocking to town, holding the meetings. And the atmosphere was not one of rural piety, believe me. It was more like a circus. They had hot dog vendors and lemonade vendors on the streets. They had booksellers selling Bibles. More than 100 newspapermen showed up. The Western Union actually had to install 22 new telegraph lines into the room so that the reporters could get news back to their paper. And the irony is, the first day, and as you can see from the picture, the courtroom is absolutely packed. And on the first day, the thing that made the biggest news in the newspapers wasn't anything to do with the trial. It was the fact that the daughters of the judge who was presiding, they showed up in court with their stockings rolled down and showing their bare legs. Now, everyone knows that's not right. But evidence was presented all the way from the admission of one 14-year-old boy that, yeah, Mr. Scopes had taught him about this evolution thing, and it ain't hurt him none. And there was evidence presented that the earth had begun over 600 million years ago, and meanwhile, all news of this trial is being telegraphed out of Dayton, and copy went to, believe it or not, England and Switzerland and Italy, Germany, China, all over the world. It was a very bitter trial, and the Attorney General cried out that the doctrines of evolution was undermining the faith of the Tennessee children and robbing them of a chance of eternal life. Bryan charged Darrow with having only one purpose, to slur the Bible. Well, on the 20th of July, Brian was put on the stand as an expert on the Bible, a true believer in fundamentalism. And it had been so hot and the crowd was so big that they decided to hold the trial outside. And Clarence Darrell, holding a Bible, began to put the fundamentalist champion, Brian, on the stand through one of the strangest examinations which ever took place. He asked Brian about Jonah and the whale, Joshua and the sun, where Cain got his wife, the date of the flood, and the significance of the Tower of Babel. Brian affirmed his belief that the world was created in 4004 BC and the flood occurred in 2348 BC. That's the way you got it from the Bible. He said that Eve was literally made out of Adam's rib, and the Tower of Babel was responsible for the diversity of languages in the world. He also believed that that big fish had swallowed Jonah. When he got to the question on where Cain got his wife, he couldn't answer, because the Bible stated that the Lord had created Adam and Eve, and they had produced 2 children, Cain and Abel. So where did the wives come from Cain and Abel? Well, tempers were getting very raised, and the heat and everything else, and Brian was defending what he held most dear, and it's almost impossible in a court of law to defend religion, because our laws are based, you have to have proof and fact, and I don't know of anyone who can go into court and say, here, this is God, here, this is an angel, and you have to have visual proof. You can't just say, I believe, because that's what religion is. Religion is based on faith. You have faith there is a God. Do I personally believe that there is a God? Of course I do. Can I go to court and prove that I have seen God? No, I don't expect to see him for a few more years. But it's not something I can prove in a court of law. Of course, we didn't know at the time that Brian was making his last public appearance, and he felt humiliated. He's going to be dead within 2 weeks. He's going to die. The next day, the judge kicked out all the testimony. Just threw it out. Scope's lawyers had been unable to get any scientific evidence before the jury, so now they could only hope that they could do what the ACLU wanted them to do, was to lose the case and take it to the Supreme Court. And sure enough, Scopes was found guilty and fined $100. They took the case to the Tennessee Supreme Court, and the Tennessee Supreme Court overruled the judge's decision on a technicality. They said that he had been found guilty, but the original judge had been in error when he fined Scopes $100, because it was on the books you could only fine him $50. So they reversed the case. So technically, they won. And the law did stay on the books, by the way. But since they had won their case, they couldn't take it to the Supreme Court, which had been the whole thing they wanted to do. They wanted to have the Supreme Court rule this Tennessee law unconstitutional. They called it the monkey trial. And it had been on the front pages for weeks. But in my research, I also found another theory, the theory that the ACLU contacted Mr. Scope. So you can believe either which way you want to go. The ACLU was involved big time. So the teaching of evolution stayed on the books in Tennessee. Meanwhile, we've got a sexual revolution going on. We got those new dance crazes, the Charleston. And if you've listened to the YouTube, I love the music. It's very fancy. And I thought this cartoon was kind of cute. Mother, when you were a girl, didn't you find it a bore to be a virgin? So things were happening in the 20s. This new woman. But the cities were being blamed because of the decrease in women's morals. The crowded cities were the cause of women's actions to be taken. They were anonymous. Whereas in a small town, and I can verify that, I lived in a very small town when my children were young, town of 15,000 population. And they would call me at work and tell me if my children were doing something wrong. And I had a pair of 6-year-olds that were always doing something wrong. The kids hated it because they couldn't get away with anything. Mother always knew what they were doing. But you get into these big towns, you can live next door to somebody for 20 years and not even know their name. So the anonymity of the big cities, they thought, was causing a lot of this women slipping in their morals. And the women were wearing short dresses, they were cutting their hair, they were smoking and drinking in public, and deciding when to have sex, if they wanted to have sex or not. And they even carried something in their purse called a diaphragm, so that they could prevent them from getting pregnant. And women were working outside the home more and more and making their own decisions without the benefit of daddy or big brother. This new independent, pleasure-hungry, sleeping with men, not going to marry woman was really a public image. And as you'll see in the YouTube, they had the purity forces, and they were measuring the length of a woman's bathing suit and damning the dresses they were wearing, the clothes that they were, the dances they were doing, and the films they were seeing. The automobile, of course, was seen as a bedroom on wheels. Now, if you've seen some of the automobiles from the 1920s, they were big enough to be a bedroom on wheels, but it doesn't take an automobile for if people were going to get frisky, if you would. They didn't need an automobile, but that's the way it was viewed, a bedroom on wheels. And I remember when I was starting to date, my father would not let me date any man who had a big car or a van. No, no. And of course, the media is carrying on about the scandalous news, and thus we hear about Floyd Collins. And if you're from Kentucky, I'm sure you know all about Floyd Collins, right? No, you don't know about Floyd Collins? Okay. Floyd Collins was a little man who was trying to find a way to make money. He was down around Mammoth Cave, trying to find something of his own. He found a little cave, and he began to explore it, about 5 miles from Mammoth Cave. He had no more purpose in mind than to find something he could do to attract business to make some money. So he crawled into this cave while 2 of his friends waited outside. He got in about 125 feet, and his foot was caught by a huge rock in a small cave-in. And this passage was so steep that when they tried to dig him out, they had to slide on their stomachs in the cold, slimy water and pass back and forth hand-to-hand rocks to get him out. And no one should ever have heard of Floyd Collins. But a man called W.B. Miller of the Louisville Courier-Journal was a small man, was on vacation, and he managed to slide down this slope, and he wanted to interview him. And as a curiosity, just something, he actually sent the story of it into his paper. And he was very amazed when he found out that the entire country, it had gone on the wire service, or gone viral as today's, I guess, vernacular, that everybody was watching this struggle. It had all the elements of dramatic and suspense. I mean, is he going to live? Is he going to die? And every day the city editors were placing the story on page 1. Now, when Mr. Miller, the journalist, had arrived, there had been only 3 men, they're friends of his, warming themselves at a fire and wondering how they're going to get their friend out. But within a short time, we had a city of 100 tents or more, and we had milling crowds that had to be restrained by barbed wire fences and state troopers. But on February the 17th, 1995, the New York Times gave a 3-column, page 1 headline, "Above the Fold," which is the prime place, "Floyd Collins dead in cave trap on 18th day." And within a month, the readers were given the news that a cave-in North Carolina had caught 71 men and 53 died. But it wasn't dramatic. It happened, and that was it. Just a mine disaster. 2 weeks later, the nation watched as a single commonplace prosecutor it watched as a commonplace prospector had tried to find some way to make money. They put his body in a glass coffin. I think your text tells you about it. And the body was stolen, and they got everything back but the leg. So the media is carrying scandalous news. It keeps you interested. You no longer want bread. Now you want cake, so to speak. So the responses to all this stuff is, well, we in Kentucky kind of retreated to back then. But we also have the KKK. And this time it's not just rednecks. It's predominantly Midwestern, as we pointed out the other day on one of our other chapters. It's our northern state, Indiana, where the biggest group was. But we didn't really need the KKK. Our African Americans knew their place. And, although the regulators are gone, we just didn't have the problem. We had a very small African American population. And Kentucky's legislators had attempted time and time again to pass an anti-evolution bill, and it passed one house and wouldn't get to the other one, or it would be vetoed. Fortunately, we had enough people in our government that had common sense to realize this was not a good law. Meanwhile, D.W. Griffith of Kentucky had directed Birth of a Nation, that extremely racist film we discussed last chapter. Segregation, yes, is becoming more commonplace. The NAACP is starting to fight it, and they even opened an office in Louisville, but they had a few successes, but not many. And Kentucky, home of the bourbon, we're pro-prohibition, but we still have all those lovely stills, especially out in eastern Kentucky. Now, Kentucky's new woman, that's a misnomer. We didn't have any new women in Kentucky. There was a few that tried to cut their hair or something, but the big cities like Louisville and Lexington may have a few. And we were aware of what was happening, but the new dances were not welcomed. Any teacher who should be fired for wearing a pair of pants or a skirt that was too short. Students could be expelled from school for cutting their hair. And actually, my mother, not in the 20s, in the early 30s, was actually kicked out of church. I don't know if you're familiar with Kentucky's churches, but Settle Memorial Church down here is one of our biggest churches. and she showed up at church with wearing a pair of pants. And the minister stopped the sermon and asked her to leave. So not only was my mother beautiful, but my mother was a rebel before her time. And I'm sorry, to me, the 20s should have been given a lot more room in this chapter, but as you can see, very few chapters and pages, and then we go right into politics. And I've tried to keep it just the chief important things. We still have political bosses. They're still retaining most of the political power. The two biggest political bosses at the time were Bingham and Brown, and they're eventually going to go on to become governors. They're Louisville millionaires. But behind the scenes, you have what we call power brokers, and everyone knew that they made deals, and they were called the invisible government because they could make or break you. Now, Edward Murrow was a governor from 1919 to 1923, and he's the only one I'm going to mention by name because there was a few things that did happen good to him. He was a Republican. Under his bailiwick, tutorage, whatever you want to call it, while he was in power, Moorhead College and Murray College were created. They got through a gas tax to do the road maintenance, which was great, and they prohibited using the convicts anymore to do maintenance on the roads. And there was a black man arrested in a trial, and I'm giving you a page number. If you haven't read it, you should look through that. He actually had to call out the National Guard to protect the black prisoner, which was a good thing, instead of letting him be taken over by the mob. Women had the vote, and the voter turnout in 1920 was 71% of those registered to vote did vote, one of the highest in the nation. And a man called Alvin W. Barkley arrives on the political scene. He's going to become very important in Kentucky's politics. He's called the Iron Man because he can make as many as 15 or 20 speeches in one day, and we'll get more to him a little bit later on. But he is just beginning to arrive on the scene in the 1920s, and although he's not a young man, he's in his 40s then. The Jockey Club becomes one of the most powerful lobbies in our state, where it used to be the L&N Louisville-Nashville Railroad, the L&N. Now the Jockey Club takes over. And we had a vote in 1924, and we were able to keep betting at the racetracks by only 10 votes. And we're only one of 3 states that allows on-track betting. But we did have a few reforms during the 20s. The schools and asylums for different, shall we say, mental and physical infirmities, they were always underfunded. And they did gain some ground and some change. We did some more prison reform because the prisons were so overcrowded. The prisoners were sick. There would be riots. They were actually called the Black Holes of Kentucky. Meanwhile, politics in Kentucky is going on its merry way, crooked as a dog's hind leg. Like, for instance, in 1925, the elections were thrown out by the court because they were so rigged. And the state also elects the first female congressman from our state in 1927. I think one of 6 or 7 from the entire United States. And Democrats win the state house in 1927. Herbert Hoover's elected president in 1928, who happens to be a Republican. And because of various other things that are happening, the Kentucky Democratic Party is starting to break up a little bit. But the Democratic governor we had at the time and the legislature, who was a great deal Democrat, there weren't that many Republicans, but they began to start fighting over important government offices. Who's going to have the power, the governor or the legislature? In 1930, we had elections, and Republicans, who once seemed to be on the rise, is now going downhill for the next couple of decades, and the reason for that is quite simple. If you're in office and something good happens, you get the credit. If you're in office and something bad happens, you get the blame. And it was the Republicans in the national office when the stock market crashed. So, of course, the Republicans are being looked at as the cause for all of our problems. By the end of the 1920s, Kentucky was ranking 15th in population. We had bootleggers all over the state, even though the amendment prohibiting the sale and distribution of alcohol had been repealed. We still had stills. And the revenue agents and the bootleggers were always having gunfights. But we're really rural. Like I said, your text points out 2.8% of Kentucky's their farmers all had only ones that had tractors. The rest of them are using mules and horses still. And only 4.3% of the residents had electricity, and this is mainly in the big cities. And of course, a lot of our timber is gone, but my manufacturers coming in, not manufacturers, but these capitalists coming in and setting up logging camps and taking the lumber unprocessed outside the state. The Klan activity's gone. As I said, we had no use for the Klan. The anti-evolutionist bills that have been put in time and time again were failing. Racetrack gambling is still strong, and the Jockey Club is still a strong lobby. We looked at some of the things going on around the country because of the movies and the radio and the newspapers. We knew what was going on. But the combination of the women not wanting to change that much, combined with our southern men not wanting us to change that much, we kind of took bits and pieces of the 20s and kept them. And for the most part, we rejected it. And we wanted to stay with the old way of doing things. Now, this nation's problems in the 1920s is not mentioned in your text. I've given you 11 things that were going on in the 1920s that had we been paying attention, we would have known something was going on. They talk about the roaring 20s, the gay 20s, the jazz 20s, and all this good stuff. And on the outside, it looked good. It looked good if you were white, you were Protestant, and you were upper class, and if you were male. If you were Hispanic, if you were African American, or if you were a woman, things were not that good. In 1920s, they figured if you made $2,500 a year, you could support a family of 4. But 65% of our families in this country lived below that line, which was below the poverty line. And of that, over half of those that lived below the poverty line couldn't even afford to buy milk for their children. Wages are falling, primarily because it's bypassing a lot. I mean, the women weren't making that much money. The blacks weren't making much money. The Hispanics weren't making much money. And if there'd been Chinese around, and we're talking nationwide, not just Kentucky, the only people that were making money were the upper middle class whites. Farm prices are depressed. Rural consumers stop buying. If they have a bad year, bad crop year, they stop buying. And if they stop buying and have 2 years in a row that are bad crops, then they default on their farm loans. Now, at this point in history, the banks could only operate on the money they had in the bank. There was no insurance. So if you have borrowed money from the bank and you don't pay it back, the bank doesn't have any money, and the bank may have to close. Well, what happened to this little business that's making money and depositing money every day? It doesn't matter. When the bank closes, it takes all her money too. So when the banks fail, it takes with them the small businesses that really weren't in bad shape, which causes the business to go bankrupt or down the hill. They have to fire the people that were working for them. And we had consumer debt. Oh my gosh, because we had instituted something called $1 down and $1 a week. You could buy houses on credit. You could buy cars on credit. You could go to department stores and buy a dress on credit. $1 down, $1 a week. That's fine as long as you've got a job. But how many dresses and cars do you need? Business investment had declined. New home starts, which is one of the things we use these days, is new home building starts. They're way down. I think between 1920 and 27, it dropped something like 50%. And excessive inventories, because I am making money selling refrigerators, so I hire a bunch of people and I'm making refrigerators like crazy. But there's only so many refrigerators you can buy, and pretty soon nobody's buying refrigerators, and I've got a warehouse full of refrigerators, so what do? I lay you off. And the Federal Reserve, instead of reducing loans rates for the loans and Fed rates and increasing the money supply, they did the exact opposite. They slowed the money supply. They raised interest rates. And the government, trying to protect our failing businesses, started raising high tariffs for anything coming into this country. Well, that's good, except that when you prevent someone from shipping something into you, they're going to raise their rates so you can't ship to them. So these 11 things were going on between 1920 and 1929, but no one took the time to look at them. This was America. Everything in this generation is better than the last generation, and the next generation is going to be better, and the stock market is forever going up and up and up. The government says buy bonds. Your boss says buy bonds. Everything to help the stock market go up and up and up. You'll get a fortune. And some people did make a fortune in the stock market. But you could even buy stocks and bonds, what they called on margin, which is basically $1 down, $1 a week. You could buy a stock and only pay a portion of it. But then they call it in, and you got to pay that margin. But there had been dozens, and no, there's been more than dozens, there's been hundreds of books written about why the stock market crashed and what was going on. But these 11 things were going on in our economy at that time, and nobody was taking a look. October the 29th, there was an unprecedented sell. Now, some of the rich people tried to shore things up by buying the stocks back for paying more than they were worth, but it didn't work. The stock market crashes. Between 1929 and 1932, the stock exchange lost more than $179 billion. $1920. And like I say, you multiply that by 14 and you'll have what it's worth today. It was not good. It was bad. The stories of the stock brokers jumping off the building were not true. I think there's only one documented case of a stockbroker committing suicide. The stories that the National Guard had to be called out to protect the stock market building from being burned to the ground by rough mobs is not true. This did not happen overnight. It didn't. The stock market crash on the 29th, and on the 30th, all of a sudden everybody's in poverty. It was a slow creeping cancer. And over the next year or two, businesses closed, businesses failed, people lost their jobs. And I think like 40 to 45% of our population was unemployed. So we'll look at the aftermath, the 1930s, in the next chapter, chapter 22. It looks more at what it was like in Kentucky. Now, most of this information I've given you is nationwide. We didn't have that many people buying stock here in Kentucky. As I said, we are rural. Is a stock market crash and depression going to hurt Kentucky? Of course it will. But nothing like it happened in Chicago or St. Louis or one of your bigger cities. That's the advantage to being rural. Like I said, we'll look at that a little bit more in chapter 22. Now, before we end this chapter, I want to tell you about something that's not in the book, but was going on in our nation, and it did eventually affect Kentucky, and it was called the Harlem Renaissance. It was a time of outpouring of music and literature and fine arts being generated at fantastic rates by the African American people. Now, there's a magazine called the Crisis Magazine. It was published by the NAACP, and a man called W.E.B. Du Bois was the editor. Langston Hughes and Jesse Redmond Fawcett are two black men who were involved in the NAACP and also with the Crisis Magazine, and they were also writers, big writers. There was music extravaganzas being written by the blacks. There were spirituals written. There were blues written. Let me ask you a question. What is black literature? Does the color of your skin make it black literature, or is it a person, black or white, writing about the black culture? A man called Cunty Cullen, who happened to be the son-in-law of W.E.B. Du Bois, by the way, he tried to be a poet, but he didn't want to be a black poet. He just wanted to write poetry. But does that make him any the less a black writer? What about the people who played on the stage? Were they black actors or actors playing black parts? But perhaps the best known people of this era are the ones who contributed in music, the jazz, the blues, the spirituals. Now, I'm sure you all have heard the song, "Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen, Nobody Knows But Jesus," and we've all sung it in church. It was written and performed by a black man by the name of Henry Thacker Burlew. Very talented man who had never picked cotton. Born free after the war. His mother had worked for a rather rich white woman in the North, and she used to have musical performances in her home, and she invited the young boy to listen, and he developed a love for music right off the bat. He even was so good he won a scholarship to the National Conservatory of Music in New York and began writing spirituals, and he always claimed he wasn't composing them, he was just writing down what he'd heard his granddad sing. Spirituals, blues, jazz, ragtime, Louis Armstrong, of course, everybody knows Louis Armstrong, Ella Fitzgerald, Pearl Bailey, Oprah Winfrey. Now, these are some names you're probably familiar with. Oprah Winfrey introduced us to black writers Toni Morrison and Zora Neale Hurston, and you may have to read one or two of these books if you stay with literature in college. Toni Morrison's Beloved, Zora Neale Hurston, Their Eyes Were Watching God. We were beginning to adopt the black talent and artists, and people were going to the black areas of Harlem to dance and play. I'm trying to remember if I talked to you about W.C. Handy last chapter or not. He's called the King of the Blues. And of course, we have that festival in Henderson. Oh, I'm sure I did. We talked about that last chapter. So did the Harlem Renaissance end in 1929? Now, I've got yes and no. It came to somewhat of a halt because all of a sudden we've got people who don't have the money to go out. And it hurt everyone, black, white, rich, poor, old, and young. It hurt everyone. Because of some programs that President Roosevelt's going to come up with in the 30s, there was some more writing of music and plays and things in the black community, but not to the extent it was in the 1920s. The good thing about it is that it opened the door. It made it acceptable. And we white people were forced to admit that it was not an anomaly if a black person could write a good book or write a play or something. The black people, given their free reign to be educated and let their juices flow, they can be creative. But in the 30s, we're so concerned with our own selves that we're not thinking about anybody else. But as I said, the artists of the 1920s, the black artists especially, paved the way for a future artist of African American heritage. I just named a few. I just touched the tip of the iceberg. There was so much good music coming out of the 1920s, so many people writing. I hope you take it upon yourself, if you didn't have to do anything for Black History Month, to go in and check out some of the contributions that the African Americans made during that time. If you haven't watched the YouTube, do so. It's a cute little 6-minute video, and in it, like I say, you'll see the policeman measuring the girl's leg to see how much she's showing. You'll see cars made for women. There's not a lot of talking behind it, but you can tell when the picture is shown or the brief video is shown what they're telling you about. The fashions are changing. Women are doing things they've never done before. They're smoking in public. They're drinking in public. They're driving automobiles. They're going swimming. The dance craze is going on. It's a lot. But sometimes just seeing the pictures and hearing a little bit of the music makes it more clear than me just saying the words. So take a deep breath, back off for a few minutes if you want to, and continue on with Chapter 21. You don't have a test this section. You just have the quiz and the 4 questions at the end of Chapter 21. So we get into the Depression next chapter and the beginnings of war in Europe.